welcome, and thank you for coming this afternoon. We are met in this suddenly neoclassical setting to celebrate the highest recognition for research scholarship at San Diego State University. This is a celebration of the Albert W. Johnson Lectureship. It is named in honor of our former Vice President for Academic Affairs, Al Johnson, who was able to join us today. Who probably more than any other person is responsible for having elevated original scholarship at San Diego State University to the lofty level that it enjoys today. So we're very much in Al's debt. We're also more particularly in Al's debt for having been instrumental in hiring the man whose accomplishments we are recognizing today, Mel Hovell. Melbourne Hovell is the 14th Johnson Lecturer. He took his undergraduate degree at San Francisco State University and his PhD at the University of Kansas. He then took a Master of Public Health degree at Berkeley in the early 1980s, and then joined the faculty at San Diego State 22 years ago, 1982. He came to San Diego State as founding head of the Division of Health Promotion and Behavioral Sciences in the Graduate School of Public Health. And then in 1988, Mel founded the Center for Behavioral Epidemiology and Community Health, which is known to those of us who deal with Mel on a regular basis as CBeach, to encourage lifestyle practices that promoted good health. Through CBeach, Mel has brought nearly $30 million in external funding to San Diego State University and has published more than 300 articles. That, by the way, works out to about $100,000 per article, which makes people like Tim Hushin particularly happy because he administers all of those funds. Mel has also been responsible for training some 200 students who have gone through CBeach during the time that he has been here, training them in promoting healthier lifestyles among our citizens. I am pleased to introduce now Distinguished Professor of Public Health as of this event, Melbourne Hovell, whose lecture is titled "The Health Race, Can Public Health Promotion Beat Disease?" Mel Hovell.
Thank you very much, Tom. I am very, very, very pleased to be here. This is a special event for me. It's one that I cherish, and I cherish it partly because of what it represents for science on this campus. And I'd like to see this not only go forward for future awardees, but do so in a way that can be even bigger and grander than this one. However, I do have a comment for those of you who have helped organize this one. I would suggest some Valium be provided to the next candidate. The process leading up to this has been a little daunting, to say the least. I'm also technologically challenged, so I will warn you now, this may not work, in which case I'll stop and require assistance, but I'll see if we can do this. This is a picture of the organizational chart for our research center. And it stands as a relatively normal organizational chart. And what I'd like to call your attention to briefly for this slide are the two classifications for the kinds of research we're doing in the center. Generally, we're doing what I call efficacy science. These are studies which are testing new interventions of one form or another to see if they can work at all. And if they do, then they might move to effectiveness science, where we would test to see if they could work in the actual real world. In addition to that, we're running epidemiological studies, which are prerequisites for both efficacy studies and effectiveness trials. Pardon me. These studies cover a lot of different kinds of content, only some of which are listed here. Measurement studies, for example, which may be just technological issues of how to do other studies. And then, obviously, we do lifestyle intervention work. And for today's presentation, I'm going to concentrate on both tobacco control and TB. And they may sound like rather disparate topics, but I'll see if I can tie them together. Another thing I'd like to point out is that the community in the Center for Behavioral Epidemiology is now probably about 90 strong. both research assistants all the way up through senior investigators. It also includes probably another 15 or 20 senior investigators literally all over the United States and now across multiple countries in the world. The work that I'm being recognized for is by no means my own. It has been produced by the collective efforts of folks in Sea Beach as well as collaborators across the country, and to a very, very large extent with the assistance of folks in the graduate division at SCSU, and particularly, I think, with some of the folks that have helped initiate and most recently elevate our IRB to new heights. Camille, would you like to stand for a moment? I'd like to particularly give credit to you. She deserves this credit partly because she's the one that has hosted a lot of my remedial education, preparing me for this. Camille has been responsible for our IRB for the last few years for sure and has moved it into very professional status. And without that, we would not have been as successful as we have been to date. Now, this slide is meant to show you some of the areas in which we've been working in collaboration, but it's also to point out that we are embarking on an attempt at understanding culture in a way that I think is different from that has been true of other behavioral sciences and efforts at understanding acculturation processes in some respects. And if we are correct, we think it may provide us a basis for at least predicting certain kinds of behaviors and clashes of behavior, and possibly even engineering changes at a population level. So the work that we're doing is going to emphasize a behavioral ecological model, and this stems directly from ecology and evolutionary systems. And that's not a mistake. The way I have tried to organize my career is following what I would call a biological process. I assume that behavioral science is a subset of biology in the main. And ecology within biology is the field that I'm implicitly highlighting in the work that we've been doing, but applying it to population human behavior. So, in our model, we think that physics, chemistry, and biology are the foundations. Ecology is the subset that we're going to be drawing as an analogy. And then the behavioral ecological model is primarily based on axioms of contingencies of reinforcement and principles of learning. Now, I just recently came back from China, where we established some additional colleague collaborative relationships. And while there, I had the occasion to watch an infinite amount of CNN and related television shows, which happened to be the only channels in English that I could receive. One of them displayed a former Nobel laureate, a Nobel laureate who was primarily trained in physics. And this individual was a quite brilliant man, and in one of his comments, he pointed out that physics and chemistry, and by implication biology, were far, far in advance of the behavioral sciences, and the reason he concluded for that is because behavioral sciences do not produce axioms. Actually, I think we have. And he happens to be dead now, so I don't have the opportunity to share that with him. But if I could, I would. So I'm going to try to touch on some of the extensions of those axioms, but I don't have time today to go through them in detail. So I want to shift to sort of the public health scope of what I hope to be presenting today. To start that, I looked up, and if John Weeks is here or any other demographers, I want to apologize right away because I am not a demographer, and so I'm going to be playing with some demography principles here, and I may mess them up a little bit. But we have about 6.3 billion people alive today on the globe. And according to the population clock, that's true for this month. So those of you who haven't gone on the web and looked at the population clock, it's a very entertaining thing to do. It's also true that by some estimates, the population of the globe may stop growing by as early as 2020, possibly as late as 2030. And even if these estimates are substantially off, it'll probably stop growing by perhaps 2050. So some of you in this room today are likely to be alive at what I consider to be a rather momentous moment. That is, the point at which the humankind is no longer increasing in overall population size. That raises a number of questions that I can't answer, such as how will infectious and non-infectious diseases contribute to population change under those conditions, and in fact even contribute to the slowing down and stopping process? What kind of shift in population characteristics are likely to take place at that point? And for me, one of the most exciting and troubling questions is how will economies based on growth adapt to a system where there is no longer population growth? About 50 to 67% of the world's population suffers from behavioral and biological risks for disease. This includes, and at least this hierarchy is my invention, so it represents my personal opinion rather than empirical base that others might agree with. But economically poor, limited or no formal education, high-density living conditions, limited protection from the elements, poor hygiene conditions, malnourishment, and victimization and prejudice. In this process, I would like to point out that all of those first bullet points are essentially behavioral. And subsumed inside them are physics, chemistry, and biological processes that might lead to disease. And when it does lead to disease, it leads to a high rate of disease burden. And once the population has a high rate of disease burden, that burden itself becomes a risk factor for additional disease. Now, one thing I'd like to point out, some of you who know me know that my political leanings are, by today's standards, at least a standard deviation or two left of center. For that reason, I have constructed this presentation relying primarily on the Pentagon and the CIA. So this report comes from the Pentagon. It's a report that's recent. And they have looked at the effects of global warming and its possible impact on the security of the nation. A kind of myopic view in some respects, but nevertheless, that's their approach. And what they've concluded is that there is likely to be a cascade of catastrophic events. These will be catastrophic enough to be killing millions more than currently estimated likely from terrorism. Probably they will be due to famine, infectious and non-infectious diseases, and violence and war. And these are listed in a sequential to provide an implication of causality. It's likely that the violence and war will be a result of the ecological changes, which will change the degree to which people's economy will withstand their current environment and the suffering that might occur. And nations, especially small nations, will probably attack other nations in order to obtain resources that may be in desperate need at that time. In spite of this being produced by the Pentagon, this report was not accepted by the Bush administration, and the Kyoto Treaty that was to study and try to control climate warming or global climate change was rejected by the current administration. Now, in the course of the ecological model that we're talking about, it relies on principles of evolution for some of the biology that's involved. And those same principles, incidentally, are also applicable to the emergence of and survival of certain repertoires of behavior. That's one of those axioms that I won't have time to go into detail. One of the things that's true, has been true all along, and is still true, is that drug-resistant microbes are currently evolving. That's a natural process. It's not something surprising or different. As an aside, if you listen to the newspaper or some of the popular press, and sometimes even in the formal medical literature, you'll hear that the misuse of antibiotics is causing drug-resistant strains to evolve. And there is some truth to that, but primarily this is a natural evolution. So when physicians misprescribe antibiotics, they hasten that evolution by some amount. When patients fail to take the antibiotics correctly, they hasten it as well. But ultimately, it's not a function of either medical practice or patient's use. It's a natural process. Now, in that process, if we look at TB, we see now a new epidemic of drug-resistant strains have already emerged. They've emerged in China. They've emerged in Russia. I believe they've emerged in India and Indochina, but I have not looked up the statistics on those two countries. In addition to that, taken as just sort of an illustration, hepatitis C is a new infection, a relatively new infection. And it is an infection which is fatal and for which we have no treatment. And it is likely that hepatitis C may rise to a prevalence or incidence rate that will surpass that of HIV within the next decade or a little bit more. And then as an illustration, I wanted to point out that influenza kills as many as 30,000 Americans a year now. And so death rates and incidence and prevalence rates of infectious diseases are alive and well, and we've been living with them for quite a while, and in some cases dying from them. That's likely to become a new problem of some severity. And many, many people that are more expert than myself in infectious disease believe that the question is not whether there will be another pandemic, but when and what severity. Now, for this discussion, I wanted to point out some of the old and new emerging infectious diseases. These are names that I think you should be familiar with in the main. I'm going to be talking mostly about TB, an old disease, but I wanted to mention things like Legionnaires, hantavirus, HIV, SARS, and most newly, or one of the most new ones, is avian flu. Now, all of these new infections have arisen, or at least arisen as major threats to groups of people in the last 10 to 20 years, if not sooner. And they are, again, a natural process. And they are happening so fast that we cannot reasonably be expected to invent new antivirals or antibiotics that will be particularly effective against these new infections. They are developing or evolving faster than we could produce such pharmaceuticals. Now, this report is taken from the CIA. They've estimated how things might look in about 20 years. This report was done in 2000. So this extends approximately 20 to 2020. And from this report, new and emerging infections pose what is presumed to be a global threat now. And they will compromise the U.S. and global security. And they're going to compromise the citizens both here and abroad. And they'll also compromise the armed forces, both here and abroad. And they'll increase the social and political instability globally. And one kind of political instability that they will affect, according to this report, is terrorism. And notice this report is now 4 years old. I think we could argue, I think the people who prepared this report might argue, that some of the terrorism that we've been facing in the last year or two may well be a function of some of the processes that we're talking about here. They may be as much a function of things like poverty and educational levels of most of the world's population and the resulting diseases that are associated with that, as they are black hats. So while Osama might be a really, really, really bad guy, he probably is just one variable in a large system that is going to create others like him if we don't understand the system and do something about it. So the global infectious disease threat also involves probably 15 to 20 million deaths worldwide, and it's the leading cause of deaths. However, infectious diseases result from changes in human behavior as well as in infectious agents. Lifestyles, land use, environmental contamination, trade and travel, and inappropriate use of antibiotics, as I alluded to earlier. I want to go back to the highlighted piece of this, the contamination. We're quickly poisoning our air, our water, and we are building cities that cause people to live in high density, often in very, very poor hygiene. So we're structuring, as part of our cultures, means of living together that will transmit infectious disease very efficiently. We are also doing it under conditions where we're concurrently being exposed to toxins, which will reduce immunological systems, make us more susceptible to disease, may cause degenerative diseases to boot. And so I'm painting a very rosy picture of an interacting process that makes for a very dim view. Here's the distribution of disease as it's generally estimated. For all infectious diseases are expected to account for about 41%, probably about 43% for degenerative diseases, and then injuries probably account for about 16%. Another note that should be pointed out here, behavioral factors contribute to the cause of infections, most degenerative diseases, quite a bit to them as a matter of fact, and almost all of injury. Yet, almost all of our approach so far from a biomedical perspective and the biomedical research system to try to deal with these diseases has been to invent either vaccines, for which we have very few that work well, or to invent medications that will cure either a degenerative or an infectious disease. Chances are that's going to be an inefficient system. Chances are we will not have a technology sufficient to invent enough medications to handle the size of the problem. And we are not yet investing in sufficient behavioral or public health behavioral science to contribute to that problem alongside the biomedical. I want to use TB as a model disease for this conversation. First of all, it is both a pulmonary infection, and that's the disease most of you think of when you think of TB. It's also a potentially fatal disease. In most cases that are not treated early, it will be. It also comes in non-infectious forms, which can be a complication in some of the details of treating and handling the overall infection. This disease has a very funny life cycle. If you are exposed to somebody with active disease, and they are breathing and coughing in your immediate vicinity, there's a very good chance that you will be exposed to the mycobacterium. And if exposed, there's a pretty good chance you'll become infected. If you are infected, there's a very good chance that nothing else will happen to you and you'll live an ordinary life. However, you will have latent TB infection. And approximately 10% of the people with latent TB infection sometime during their life will have active disease. It will re-emerge as an active disease, probably due to some form of trauma where your immune system is compromised, say in the context of another illness. And usually that occurs during older age. However, with the diseases I've just mentioned, it could occur at a younger age in the context of, say, a new flu that's going through the community. Now, in the United States, the TB, these are active case rates. The TB that we suffer comes mostly from immigration, from countries, from people in countries where the endemic rates are relatively high. And these are the rates that we would expect to see in our country. We have recently completed one TB trial in San Diego area with Latino population. And some areas in San Diego for adolescents, the Latino adolescent, the rates run between 20 and 40% for latent disease infections. Now, for latent disease prevalence rates, the published information varies a little bit from CDC and other sources, but it's about 5%. But I have to caution you that there has not been a strong population-based survey of latent infection in my lifetime that I'm aware of. And so these are estimates based on subsamples and maybe quite a bit in error. My guess is the rates may actually be smaller for the Caucasian middle-class population. And while for high-risk subgroups, latent disease might be as high as 20, even 40%, my guess is for some subsets it could go even higher. Now, since I've recently come back from China and I had to learn a little bit about it, I thought I'd highlight the TB situation as I've understood it for China. There's over 400 million LTBI cases in China today. That's 400 with an M, 400 million. There are approximately 1.4 to 2.5 million active TB cases per year in China. That's an estimate because, again, population surveys have not been done. And something in excess of 250,000 deaths are attributable to TB each year. Somewhere between 7 and 18% of the cases of active disease in China are known to be drug resistant. 7% are multi-drug resistant, and 18% are single drug resistant. That means that for that portion of the cases in China, the available medication for treating TB probably won't work. Now, for the law of large numbers, I've made some numbers up here. This is strictly a fiction, so I didn't go to any higher order source than my own crude handling of simple mathematics here. If we assume that a medical assistant, a lay medical assistant, could handle approximately 200 active patients in a developing country such as China or Latin America or India, it would require 10,000 of them to handle the active cases in China. They would probably require about 1,000 medically trained supervisors to supervise the 10,000 medical assistants. It might require 20,000 lab technicians to handle the diagnostic procedures and laboratories involved in diagnosing and treating TB. And that doesn't count the logistic support necessary, such as transportation, housing, and drug manufacture and distribution for the army of people involved in addressing the disease. This is the law of very, very large numbers. 400 million latent disease cases in China. If I'm assuming that a field worker could address the relatively easy to manage treatment of somebody with simple infection, it would require 4 million such workers in China. It would probably require at least 40,000 supervisors in China and probably at least 400 doctoral level directors to supervise latent disease infection aggressive prevention program. And to that, we would have to add logistics. This, incidentally, is larger than something that I think our current military could handle, and it's the only group that I'm aware of that might have the infrastructure system to actually marshal these kinds of bodies of people to do this kind of work. Now, this suggests two things to me. First, the standard clinical process of trying to either treat active disease or use a medical procedure to prevent disease in many instances is probably not feasible as we currently approach it. Without controlling latent TB infections in places like China as well as in places like the United States, active disease will continue. And in China, that would probably be at about the rate of 1 million active cases a year. My guess is the same would be true of India, where I think the rates are actually a little bit higher. Now, to continue the story, as I've already suggested a little bit, infectious diseases are not alone. They also come along with the non-infectious or degenerative diseases, and they are reciprocally causal. So while an infectious disease may not truly cause some degenerative diseases, they certainly would make them worse. And if you have a degenerative disease, you're more likely to be infected by an infectious agent, and the disease you get from it may be more severe. So they interact to make matters worse. And in that fashion, we can expect an increasing burden worldwide, including developing countries, from both infectious and non-infectious diseases. And these will include heart disease, diabetes, cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And many of these diseases are a function of the common lifestyles that we're familiar with, such as diet, physical activity, drug use. And what I mean by that are drug abuse systems, such as alcohol, other drugs of addiction, and tobacco in particular. And, as I alluded to earlier, work and other practices that contaminate the environment. So if you're exposed to toxic air, toxic water, then you're more likely to suffer both degenerative disease as well as infectious disease, and possibly their combination. So how we structure our societies and live in them makes a big difference to both kinds of disease burden. Worldwide diabetes is the disease I selected as an illustration. These data reflect predominantly type 2 diabetes. This is a form of diabetes that is attributable primarily to diet and probably inadequate exercise and its combination. And currently, the prevalence rates of diabetes worldwide is estimated to be about 135 million. And in a few years, that will almost double, or pardon me, more than double, to 300 million. 75% of those new cases are going to occur in developing countries. And that's also true of heart disease and cancer and a number of other so-called degenerative or chronic diseases that are not usually attributed to infection. Most of those are going to take place in India and China, and that's mostly because that's where most of the world's populations are. Probably also in Indochina. So the burden of old and new infections, as well as the burden of a degenerative disease, may be pandemic in the third world by 2020. That's one of those electronic gadgets. This is a slide that I didn't understand, so I've just changed it, but it didn't change anything except the italics. Role of lifestyles. How do we change diet, physical activity, drug use, and cultural practices that damage our ecology? The U.S. objects to the WHO report to reduce obesity. Eat more fruits and vegetables, limiting fat and salt, limited advertising aimed at children, and tax subsidies to encourage healthy food consumption were the recommendations from the World Health Organization's report. And again, the Bush administration has challenged these recommendations and did not agree with them for our country. And these challenges, as were the Kyoto Treaty objections, were, in my judgment, based on short-sightedness and short-term gains for large-scale U.S.-based commercial businesses. Now, one of our colleagues that we know and love well, Jim Salas, is currently engaged in lifestyle research And much of that lifestyle research involves physical activity and to some extent diet. And he recently has published a op-editorial in the Union Tribune. And this was an extremely well-timed and extremely well-written op-ed. And the gist of this op-ed was to counter the Bush administration's argument that the obesity epidemic taking place in both children and adults in this country today, and which is probably gaining strength in other Western countries as well as developing, is not really due to personal choices and personal responsibility. And so in countering the message that we should somehow curtail or manage fast food and other systems of designing cities that might have bearing on physical activity, those kinds of policies might make a difference, but they go counter to a model where government is supposed to leave business alone and leave the Darwinian model, the social Darwinian model, to play for big business. That has been justified on the grounds that individuals are making decisions to eat at McDonald's and to overeat at McDonald's, and that individuals are making decisions not to exercise. We've been running a study for the last few years at the local airport. We've been watching the people going up the, this is at Terminal 1 for those of you familiar with it, watching them go up and down the stairs or escalators. And I'm here to report that we have extremely accurate data showing 95% of the population going in and out of Terminal 1 uses the escalators exclusively. Furthermore, that's even if they're going down. And over half of the population that we've measured has been judged by observation to be fit enough to use the stairs, not hampered by baggage or children or anything else of that nature. And we've measured approximately 17,000 people to come to those conclusions. I don't think that it's simply a choice. Designing an airport where the escalators are so convenient and relative to the stairs generates an automatic response, in effect, for most people. And the population data that we've collected there certainly verifies that. Now, this is child development in Mexico. This is a preschool child. I think we could probably all agree that this child has not elected to become a smoker. This is not something this child was born to do. This is something that an industry has caused and a culture has supported. And in doing so, we end up with lifestyle problems that range from diet, exercise, drug use, and abuse that cause considerable disease and cost us dearly. Tobacco is probably one of the most important in that list. Again, the WHO has convened a framework, a convention to have a treaty, an international treaty, I might add, one of the first on the health of nations to restrict tobacco. It is killing potentially as many as 10 million people by 2025, and it's already killing at least 5 million now. It leads to illiteracy, malnutrition, multiple forms of diseases, increased health care costs, and premature death. It kills at the height of productivity for most people. It delimits the healthy workforce, and it costs approximately $200 billion a year, 30% in developing countries. And in those developing countries, this means that people don't eat well because they are using what precious resources they have to sustain the tobacco addiction. The WHO recommended tobacco control treaty. They called for efficacious and cost-effective policies. Tobacco taxing, price increasing, bans on advertising, and smoke-free environments. Again, the Bush administration did not support it. How do we control and prevent pandemics, including those that may be related to lifestyles? Effective global surveillance is crucial and effective response. Governments currently tend to promote medical solutions. So we are in the business of building drugs, either vaccines or treatment procedures. Personnel-intensive interventions will not be feasible and will not prevent most diseases when applied. Currently, our HIV treatment is relatively effective in this country, and the package of medications is called HART. I think that's poetic. It takes 5 or 6 or 7 medications. It's quite difficult to stay on. You stay on it for an extended period, and it seems to extend life perhaps as long as 10 years. And it also generates heart disease. So in the course of surviving HIV, you also have to begin taking medication to keep you alive from the disease that it's causing. And so once again, we are increasing the the difficulty of sustaining quality of life in those who are infected. So what is the solution? One solution is policy interventions that alter population behavior and prevent and control both infection and non-infectious diseases. That's where our ecological model comes in. These are just a few names that I listed because they're relatively current, but the model actually extends quite a few years before this. But Deborah Cohen, who's now in the Rand Institute, has published a paper on structural models, and she has pointed out that things like graffiti in certain neighborhoods is an indicator of crime and violence and infectious and non-infectious diseases. And when you clean up the graffiti in certain neighborhoods, some of those other consequences seem to get better as well. Abby King from Stanford has done some work looking at exercise and pointing out that if you look at sort of the family and then the neighborhood and the city and the state and the nation and so forth, you can see different influences on physical activity, and she's looked at that in what I call a kind of topographical model. And Jim Salas is looking at it from an ecological perspective, building in some psychosocial variables, and he's emphasizing both city design for mixed utility, and he's also looking increasingly at policies. And how does government and even business construct policies that would affect behavior? And in our work, we have been looking at it primarily from a contingency point of view, and we're looking at it from a policy point of view. In both Jim's work and our work, we sort of overlap, with him emphasizing the physical environment a bit more than we have, but we do both emphasize the entire continuum. What's different about the way we're doing this? The main difference is that we're targeting our understanding of behavior and behavior at population level, and we're emphasizing both the physical environment and the social environment. And even with the work that Jim Salas is doing, we're pushing to a somewhat smaller emphasis, those things that would normally be called psychosocial variables. So we're not worried too much about how people make individual decisions to do things. We're worried more about how we would build our environments in such a way that they might actually change whole populations' behavior. So in looking at how this might work, if you have an individual and you're trying to understand their lifestyles, we would assume that the co-workers, friends, and family members are going to be the proximal influences of their behavior. And that also laws and policies at either a national, local and national level, and even international level, would also influence their behavior. It also influences it in an interacting fashion such that these laws and policies accumulate over time and in space. So from a more operant perspective, those of you who are familiar with the simple operant models of antecedent behavior and consequences, the antecedents in this illustration is that you may have somebody who creates a sidewalk policy in a local community. That affects somebody who's a walker in this area here, whose walking behavior will increase as a function of having more pleasant surroundings and more walking trails available to them. And the consequences of walking on such trails may be to enjoy walking more. So it's reinforcing. But I've put in a third player to illustrate the interaction among these kinds of contingencies. A friend who may like to get together and just chat may now be finding himself actually walking with this individual in order to have an opportunity to chat with them. In doing so, this behavior is prompting this person to walk. And because they're now walking on a nice walking system, they're actually going to be reinforced for walking too, and you could have a cascade where this person now becomes a regular walker. So the issue of the behavioral ecological model is not simply that people are reinforced for doing something. That's well known, has been for a long time. But what we're trying to understand are interactions between reinforcement systems that may culminate across people and from one level of society to another. So we call this our hierarchy of contingencies. In this instance, the individual might be at this point, and national and international contingencies may be at the societal or even international societal level. We believe these are likely to be bidirectional. And so, for example, if you remember the evolution of our own tobacco control program in the state of California, it started by mostly physicians, and physicians who were opposed to tobacco use. They were one of the first groups to recognize the evils and health risks of tobacco. That generated some legislation which generated our current policies in the state of California. The current policies have actually changed the entire population's reaction to tobacco. Mostly, it has changed non-smokers' behavior towards smokers. And that's crucial for changing cultures and lifestyles. Notice that's uniquely different than taking a clinical model which would ordinarily take the smoker and do something to them to get them to stop. We need to do things to the non-smokers who will in turn do things to smokers. Or better yet, to the folks that are at risk of becoming smokers that will keep them from doing so. Now, the interacting contingencies that I referred to earlier for walking can also be considered for a whole host, in fact, all behaviors. So in this example, we might have a policymaker that creates an environmental policy that generates trains as a practical source of transportation in our cities or between cities. And interactions between individuals might reciprocally be reinforcing in such a way that it might actually get a new individual to ride trains who otherwise wouldn't. That stems from a policy system. You can also imagine feedback from these systems back to policy individuals in such a way that it might reinforce the policy practice behavior as well. There are hundreds of these ABCs that are left out of this sequence in a causal chain, and I don't even know what they all are. We're trying to figure that out. One of our previous studies was aimed at tobacco prevention in adolescence or pre-adolescence, and we got 150 orthodontists together and trained half of them to counsel the kids not to start smoking. And the trial didn't work. It didn't change the incidence rate significantly when we first looked at it. But we went back and looked at it again, and what we found out is that it worked for the kids who had friends who think smoking is cool. So, translation, if you are a child and you have friends who are smokers or friends who think it would be really neat to start smoking, and they're socially promoting smoking, and your orthodontist tells you not to do that, that interaction protects you from the social pressure of your peers. But if you don't have those kind of friends, you could view that as somebody relatively safe from tobacco at baseline, then having your dentist ask you not to start doesn't affect you because you were probably not very likely to in the first place. So we've seen an interacting contingency system. In this sense, it's the dentist's activity interacting with a child to counter the interactions from a friend. And having discovered that, I think that's particularly profound because normally we would expect the friend's influence to be the greater. So we're emphasizing environmental causal agents, we're emphasizing principles of behavior, and a hierarchical and interacting model. And what we're trying to do now is construct operational definitions of measures, and it's applied to both individuals and populations. Our hypotheses are that explicit contingencies may be measured best by experimental design. However, we may be able to create markers of contingencies that are probably going to be at first crude measures. And if we can assess the density of those markers in a population, we would predict that that would be associated with the same behaviors that are expected to change as a function of the contingencies. We've been doing this in a cross-sectional and cross-cultural study in both San Diego and Mexico. This is a TRDRP-supported study where we are doing population-based sampling in Guadalajara, in Tijuana, and in San Diego. And our sample is restricted to Latino population in all three cities, so we're not comparing non-Latinos in San Diego. And what we're looking for are tobacco use in the three cities and the degree to which the markers for tobacco use, the things that we think might either prevent it or promote it, differ across the three cities. Now, for those of you who may not be completely familiar with it, obviously most of you know that we're next door for Tijuana and San Diego. But Guadalajara is way down here in central Mexico, and it's approximately 2,000 miles away. And our working hypothesis for this study is that if there is an influence from the tobacco control program in California, it's probably a function of movements of people across the border locally. So when people from Mexico visit here, when people from here visit there, they interact and they carry with them exposure to the California anti-tobacco program. We also assume that that kind of exposure is virtually non-existent in Guadalajara. So what are we looking for? For the different kinds of behavior, this is secondhand tobacco smoke exposure. Tobacco use, exposure, and home policies. And home policies are where some families have restricted all smoking or some smoking in their home. But what we're trying to find out is, are these differences in rates of smoking a function of differences across the three cities for exposure to anti-tobacco messages, access to cessation programs, models within their community, social and normative acceptance, and acculturation processes. Here's some preliminary data that are literally hot off the press. What we're seeing right now for people who report never having been a smoker is a cascade where we see slightly fewer in Tijuana than in San Diego and substantially fewer in Guadalajara, suggesting, as we expected, that there is more, first of all, that there's a gradient dose effect across the cities, and secondly, that the greater difference is in Guadalajara. For those who've been small amount smokers, we see the opposite transition, but the same kind of gradient, where in San Diego, the lowest level are smokers, intermediate in Tijuana, and largest in Guadalajara. For daily smokers, you see a similar gradient, and for former smokers, you see a similar gradient. And the gradient is more of a bifurcation for the occasional smokers, where the two Mexican cities are more similar than we expected. So occasional smokers may be a problem, and they're not well understood generally in the literature on smoking anywhere in the country. We've also looked at daily environmental tobacco smoke exposure, and we've looked at it in home, workplace, car, other places, and anywhere, meaning if you ask the question just anywhere you happen to be, what does that gradient look like? And once again, we see generally the same gradient with the possible exception of the car, and I suspect that may be because the transportation systems in Mexico do not rely quite as much on cars as we do. So there may be some interaction going on there that we need to yet further explore. Now, we've also looked at policies on smoking, and these are policies that may be set by a workplace or that residents may set in their own private home. And again, we see a similar gradient in the expected direction. And what's exciting about this is this is not just a differential in the level of smoking or the level of smoke exposure. This is a differential in one of the hypothetical systems that we think would alter smoking and smoking exposure. And it's following a similar pattern. When we look at normative acceptance of smoking, we see similar patterns. Now, you'll notice there are only 2 bars in these graphs, and that's because we do not yet have the Guadalajara data. Similar pattern here. When we look at criticism of smoking, we see a similar pattern once again. I want to point out something that we've also seen in our Korean sample, which we've done in both Korea and Koreans in California. And it looks to us like spouses don't work so well. Our hypothesis there is that when your wife criticizes you, you don't get a divorce, so you don't need to worry about it. But when your friends and family criticize you, you better watch out. That hasn't been verified, however. When we look at social criticism in public places, we see a similar pattern. Once again, with the possible exception being healthcare environments where the rates are only subtly different. So what we're seeing so far is that in almost every single instance in the Mexican study that we're currently running, we're seeing a verification of some of our hypotheses. When we've looked at our Korean sample, as I alluded to a moment ago, we're seeing acculturation processes that are operating. They're operating differently for men and women. And so when men move from Korea to California and become acculturated here, their rates of smoking go down. When women move from Korea to California, their rates of smoking go up. And we believe that's an interaction between the home culture and the adopting culture here that operates differentially by gender. And we would go so far as to say that men and women actually live in different worlds. I think there are other people that have thought that. Now, one of the things that we have done, and in fact we have achieved national and international reputation for launching intervention trials to control passive smoke exposure for children in private residences. And this is a family who is working with us in current studies who agreed to be photographed for this purpose. It's the 3rd leading preventable cause of death. It's associated with lung cancer, coronary disease, asthma, sudden infant death, and many, many others. In the Western communities of U.S., Australia, and Canada, the rates of exposure of children is probably around 35% at a minimum. And my guess is it's closer to 50 or 60%. The high end of these range, by the way, come from cotinine assays done by CDC. So they're objective measures, not self-report measures. And I find that interesting because they're probably a little bit more reliable. There's limited data on secondhand smoke exposure in adults. It appears in California that there's probably over 50% of adults who are exposed. And in the case of smokers, probably 75% of them are exposed to other people's smoke. And in third world and developing countries, there's even less information about exposure. Now, we have started our work on passive smoke exposure in homes very much in a sort of Trojan horse analogy. We have taken the position that passive smoke is a little bit like mom and apple pie. It is a cultural value in our society, and in my experience, in all societies, to protect children. And so when you go into families and say, this is a serious risk, and you're willing to roll up your sleeves and help them change it, generally speaking, addicted mothers and husbands, fathers, are willing to try. And my experience is that almost all legislators, government officials, medical officials, even people in business that are unrelated to public health or medicine, when approached, will tell you they're absolutely supportive of protecting children from passive smoke. So we believe it's a means of promoting cessation, and we've done some work here where we're trying to build in some counseling for both passive exposure and cessation. It's also a means of decreasing tobacco promotion media, especially that might affect children, and possibly decreasing social support generally for tobacco overall. Now, in our work, parents are contracted to reduce their child's ETS exposure. We set short-term goals, we ask them to self-monitor, and we provide them with positive feedback as they try. And we help them with brainstorming when they run into problems where they can't seem to quit smoking for breakfast while they're fixing children's cereal before they go to school. Under those conditions, we'll negotiate with them and come up with something that might work for the individual family. We've tested these procedures in a number of trials. I'm only going to show you a couple here. We've tested them in cases where we have repeated sessions. Those sessions are usually in the home, sometime by telephone. This is a slide that shows an intermediate step in our counseling process. This mom is obviously still a smoker, and you can see her baby's in the doorway. She has moved outside to smoke the cigarette rather than smoke it indoors and expose the child to the smoke. This would be an intermediate step in our hope to get her to move completely outside and under conditions where the child isn't even in the doorway but is being supervised by another adult. Now, in one of our first trials with asthmatic children from Kaiser and elsewhere in the community, we tested 2 measurement control procedures and a counseling process. And what we found at approximately this point in time is that those who received counseling had a substantially and statistically significant lower exposure. I want to call your attention, though, that this group, which received most of the same measures, and this group that received just the most minimal measures, also had substantial decreases in exposure, and we've seen that in almost all of our studies. This was one of our first TRDRP trials, and we had the fortune to get funding for some follow-up. And so we were able to give these same people additional information at this point in time on how to control exposure, and followed them further. And in fact, I'm not sure what color that is. My wife tells me I'm color stupid, but at any rate, it's the not green line. And at this point in time, that is a significant difference in the group that was provided the information. So what we think is going on is that we're able to successfully lower ETS exposure in asthmatic children. We also did this in healthy children. This was funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Society, Foundation. And these are the self-report evidence of what happens when we do the same kind of counseling over time. And this is a significant decrease for both groups, as well as a statistically significant increase in the level of reduction for the counseled group, the lower line. This was the first study, however, where we had access to urine assays for cotinine. And what we found in this case is during the intervention period, we see an increase in cotinine in both groups, in spite of the report of lower exposure. We're not sure why that's happening, by the way. It may be that there's some lag time in the biological reactions. And in the experimental group, this finally reverses, and it's a net decrease of about 4%, if I recall correctly. But the controls continue to go up. So by self-report measures, we've made a difference where the experimental group improves more than the control. And in the cotinine assays, we've made a difference by preventing a continued high level or increase in cotinine. So our conclusions from this are that our coaching procedures, which is what we generally call them, can work to reduce exposure. However, we do not yet know whether this can be done in a regular environment, in, say, a clinic or other applied setting. And eventually, what we'd hope to move to is where ETS exposure, especially for children, young children, does not occur even when families are outdoors. Now, the reason I put this slide on is to provide an emotional association. What I'd like to point out is that our behavioral ecological model has probably been employed with unlimited resources and with extraordinary precision and effect by the tobacco industry. They've done a far better job than anyone in public health or medicine has ever done or has even planned to do in the foreseeable future. The industry targets susceptible populations, third world immigrants. Public policy is less likely to protect these people, so if they are addicted, they're likely to be unable to afford cessation treatment, and they are unable to protect themselves from the media and other marketing procedures. By targeting these kinds of people, they also introduce addicted populations back into, say, California, who can vote and can influence policies that may be liberalized to reduce the controls on tobacco. So I actually view the industry as operating a Trojan horse to counter the tobacco control efforts that have been going on. They have dependence on tobacco sales and taxes in government services. When we were in Hungary, they were paying for police, they were paying for emergency services, and they are paying for other road repair and even some church services. So the tobacco industry is what I'm referring to, are intertwined into the heart of society in some communities to a point where none of the population is likely to object to tobacco policies or curtail their business for fear that their ambulance services may be shortchanged in exchange for that. So, and some of that happens in our country, although to a bit lesser degree. They also lobby for friendly laws. In this country, they've been lobbying at the federal level primarily, and the laws they've been lobbying for are to supersede all state and local policies. So they then get a very, very, very weak tobacco restriction law at the federal level, which vetoes all other laws at any other level, and thereby liberalizes the industry to promote the addiction. And probably most important is the tobacco industry has been pointing most of its advertising, most of its lobbying effort at non-smokers. It wishes to teach those, the majority of the population who don't smoke, that it is the individual smoker's right to do so, that we should get out of their way and that we have no right to curtail it. And yet that's not true of any other lifestyle behavior which is either harmful to the individual engaging in it or harmful to others around them. So what are the economic and political contexts in the Mexico application? While we have been studying in Mexico, the Philip Morris and the British American Tobacco Company was negotiating with the government. They also established a group of physician scientists to support tobacco and to support passive smoking as safe, including safe around children. And the Latin American governments have agreed to not ban ETS. Although I think just recently that may have changed in some parts of Mexico. This was occurring a few months ago, a few years ago. So what they produce is a cascading set of contingencies for tobacco support. That occurs in sports events, TV, movies, sponsored events, and of course in media. Now much of their media has been curtailed, so at least in this country. So that's now in more subtle form. It's in forms like PSAs. It's in forms such as putting on a youth anti-tobacco program, which has been designed uniquely to increase the probability that youth will take up smoking. But all of the dialogue in the program is anti-tobacco. It says things like, don't smoke because that's for mature adults. And any good developmental psychologist will tell you that most preteens are striving to be mature. And if smoking is one way to be there, that's likely to contribute to it. So they create a system that reflects on our democratic values and causes us to view the tobacco industry as engaging in reasonable business and promoting reasonable things that individuals can either elect to do if they wish or not, and that we should lead them to that. And they lobby for that same outcome. So what do we need to do? We need to change that process. Government must regulate industry. I believe it must regulate all industry, not just the tobacco industry. It needs to eliminate the tobacco industry eventually. We don't allow cocaine in a free and liberal society such as we have now, and yet we allow tobacco, which is far more damaging than cocaine. We don't allow marijuana, and even though it is usually a smoked product and probably damaging because of that, it's far less dangerous than nicotine. And we don't allow that either. So this is really about financial contingencies in the short term. We need to understand those and understand how to change them. Now, we wouldn't be in this business if there wasn't a little bit of missionary. And I do think we do have some hope, and I'm going to share it with you here. First of all, one of our students from San Diego State, who's now in Arizona, has done a thesis, a very exciting thesis. And in this thesis, he grabbed up 100 beach businesses, bathing suit shops, surfboard shops, and others, and divided them into 2 groups of 50 and sent them a newsletter weekly. In the newsletter, he said, your business may be damaged by the pollution of the water here, and you should take action to protect your business. And we pulled evidence from Florida where they have had both serious damage to business due to pollution and also repairs from that pollution. And what we found from that was a wild increase in political activity, writing letters to local and state officials to urge them to clean up the water on the San Diego coast. This was a small study, it was a pilot study, and so it didn't carry us to the level of actually changing policy. But it showed us we could engineer social activism. And everyone in this room is now receiving such emails daily that either represent the Republican side or the Democratic side of our current government, urging you to take action accordingly. And that's doing something similar. The difference in our work here is that we tied it to an economic benefit for the audience that we were serving. One of my associates, Elaine Bloomberg, has recently been completing some studies with adolescents trying to prevent HIV, where again, we were targeting their change to social activism, to go out into businesses and teach the businesses how they could contribute to the prevention of HIV by such things as installing condom machines in bathrooms. One of our current students, who's also a member of the American Cancer Society locally as a middle management personnel, has just been approved by IRB and has been approved by the American Cancer Society to do a social activism study with the American Cancer Society volunteer pool. And there again, we're going to be sending them newsletters to promote action to prevent cancer and see if they can. Our goal will be to see if we can get them to do that. We hope that if we can demonstrate that, it may be a model for actually changing policies. Recently, the NIH has adopted a new policy. This is a policy that is really changed. For those of you who don't know NIH, it's really an institution that promotes individual junior investigator science. The concept is that the researchers out in the big bad world, places like San Diego, have creative backgrounds and will come up with things we could never otherwise come up with, and they're there to support it. And they promote individual science, and that has been disciplinary. They're now shifting to an interdisciplinary model. And this is really, really serious. They've come to the conclusion that being a chemist is insufficient for understanding the cause of disease, let alone fixing it. Being a biologist, ditto. Being a behavioral science, ditto. So the solution is we have to work together and we have to share those expertise in order to try to fix things. It's only now that the behavioral sciences have been recognized for about 10 years as part of NIH. And so we're still a little shallow in the overarching culture of NIH, but we're growing. And I think this interdisciplinary model will catch on in the next 10 years and we'll be well in it. If so, then it may be possible to add the biological sciences, their underpinning in physical and natural science, to the behavioral sciences for a more powerful solution to some of our problems. So one of the solutions to our problem is an NIH policy. It's changing the researcher's behavior in ways that may contribute to the solution. Now, if I go back to the global infectious disease theme, international cooperation coordinated by the World Health Organization has also started. They have actually gotten agreement from 8 developed nations to work together. And cooperation from this source might lead to national and international change in policies, at least for infectious disease. If this group can get together with the new NIH policy, and if we can add behavioral science to the equation, then we may be on the road to repairs. To take examples from local community, nationally first and then locally, more specifically in San Diego, Rhode Island just this last week voted to support a workplace smoke-free environment law, almost unanimously. Big Tobacco is striking out in Petco Park. We've just agreed locally to restrict smoking in, I'm not sure if it's the whole area or major areas, and that's in an open-air theater environment, which means we're now restricting smoke outside, an issue that the tobacco industry has been fighting to avoid for at least the last 10 years. And I think most interesting is that Los Angeles has now declared some of their beaches smoke-free, and that happened in the last few weeks. So there's reason for hope. I think it's going to come from policy-based interventions in the long run, and those policy-based interventions are going to be constructing new contingencies that change people and mostly population behavior. So based on the CDC Global Infectious Disease Program reports, it's not possible to protect the U.S. without controlling infections globally. That's a very important message. We cannot close our doors. Because even if there is a pandemic in China, the destruction to China's economy will very severely destroy, if not destroy, our own. And that could occur in India, could occur and is to some extent in Russia now. And so even if we are not personally exposed to a disease agent, we are very likely to be exposed to the consequences of the destruction that disease will cause in another country. So we need to work together not only for the disease control, but for developing systems that will prepare economic environments around the world. And I think that's going to require a behavioral science approach at least as much as a biological. And lest somebody here go away with the wrong message, I am interested in a collaborative model, not an exclusionary model. We cannot solve this without the biological base. And from this report, the window, the timing within which we may be able to do something that would actually repair us, possibly prevent a major pandemic or worse, may be closing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mel. That was wonderful, both for its data and point of view. I'm not going to plug back in, so I'll just speak loudly enough that I hope you can hear me. In recognition of today's event, we've prepared a plaque for Mel, which reads San Diego State University, 2003-04, Albert W. Johnson University Research Lectureship, awarded to Melbourne Hovell, PhD, MPH, Distinguished Professor of Public Health, in recognition of your contributions to San Diego State University and to the field of public health, April 28, 2004. In a nation whose citizens have placed their health at risk, you have provided the evidence and the direction for healthier lifestyles. Members of all communities may experience longer and more fulfilling lives as a result of your dedicated efforts. To Mel Hovell. Reception plan for Mel, and by extension in honor of Al Johnson. It will be at the Faculty Staff Center starting immediately, and we hope as many as you as possible can join us there.
Do you want to ask questions?
I was actually going to give people an opportunity to interact with you at the reception.
Okay, fine.
We want to get that.
Al, I can't see you out there, but thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank you.